Kevin, have you been building your guns? So one thing that in churches we love to do is say, turn to your neighbour. But for this next section, don't turn to your neighbour, okay? So I'm going to start off with a bit of a story from one of my work colleagues, of past work colleagues. So they would always find a way at any team meeting to work into a story about the time that they went sailing around the world in a yacht. There would always be some sort of convoluted way to bring this story back into the conversation. It could be about any subject or any random bit of conversation, but it would always end up being turned around to, on my trip sailing around the world, we did this or we did that, and that's how we built such a strong team. It started to become a bit of a game at work to try and work out how long it would take before that story was brought up. You know, is it going to be 5 minutes, 10 minutes? And so eventually I got a bit fed up of it and decided to do some research and found out that it was at least 15 years ago that this story was. That was the pinnacle of this person's life. And ever since then, they'd been riding on that story, and anything else they did just paled in comparison. They'd peaked and had nowhere else to go. After that, nothing could quite top that experience. And it's almost like they stopped learning and growing after that point as well. So, usually in the team meetings within about 10 minutes, we'd be back on the yacht. Now, don't get me wrong, it was an amazing achievement, but that had become their only story. They were stuck in the past. And today we're going to look at someone that's complete opposite. We're going to look at Joseph. If anyone could have said, back when I was my dad's favourite, life was great, it was Joseph. But instead of clinging to the past, he kept moving forward. He persisted through betrayal, through slavery, through false accusation, and through prison. He resisted bitterness and despair. And because of that, his best days weren't behind him. They were still ahead of him. So you can turn to your neighbour and say, your best days are still ahead of you. Now, I'm sure anyone who knows the story of Joseph will know that he was a bit of a dreamer. And he had some pretty big dreams. They were not always portraying those around him in the best light, though. They were dreams that saw him raised above his siblings, dreams that would see him as paving the way for his future. But his dear brothers never saw it that way. If we look in Genesis 37, we'll start at verse 5. One night, Joseph had a dream, and when he told his brothers about it, they hated him more than ever. Sounds like a proper brotherly thing to do, that, doesn't it? Any excuse to hate your brother. But it goes on. Listen to this dream, he said. We were out in the field, tying up bundles of grain. Suddenly, my bundle stood up, and your bundles all gathered around and bowed before mine. His brothers responded, so you think you'll be our king, do you? Do you actually think that you will reign over us? And they hated him all the more because of his dreams and the way he talked about them. Now, talk about having a big dream. That's a pretty massive dream right there, don't we think? That's the type of dream that could get him in trouble if he shared it with the wrong type of people. Now, he obviously shared it with his brothers, and we saw that reaction. They didn't like that. I don't know that many people would, though. Would you? If someone was to say, "Yeah, I'm gonna reign over you, and you're gonna bow down to me," it's probably not going to reflect the best on anyone, is it? You're not going to want to listen to that person for much longer. But I'd like to think that Joseph would have realized that he's not just going to wake up one day and he's going to be in this position of power. That I think you would have realized that there would have been some sort of a journey to it. That, yeah, there's steps that he's got to take. There's a journey that he's got to go on to get to that position. Now, these dreams weren't just Joseph dreaming about some fantasy. Yeah, completely made up. It's obvious he was his father's favorite son. And so in some respects, he would be treated better than his siblings. But this dream takes things to a completely different level, doesn't it? His brothers, they were rather jealous of him, and probably rightly so. As I'm sure they didn't need to hear this from him. It's not exactly the type of thing that you want to hear being shared to you. And I think that would make anyone a lot more disgruntled. But these dreams weren't just dreams, they were God-given dreams. Yeah, they're pretty big things. Yeah, it's not like you're going to dream that you can fly by yourself one day, you'll grow wings or something, like those type of crazy dreams that we could have. These are dreams that God has placed there. Yeah, that's God revealing his plans and purposes for Joseph's life. Now, we can learn from Joseph and how he shared his dreams with his brothers that there may have been a bit of a sense of arrogance there. That he was already his father's favorite, and that he was given so many lavish gifts that his brothers just didn't get. A nice coat of many colors, yeah, treated like royalty in his own home. Perhaps if he was to stay humble about his dreams, that might have been a bit of a better way to go about it. After all, he didn't have to share the details of those dreams with his brothers. So the first thing that we can learn from Joseph is being humble. He knew what God was planning, the big things for his life, and that one day he would reign over his brothers. And if we want to see those dreams come to pass, sometimes it's often better to remain humble and remember that it's God's plan and not ours. Now, I'm sure we've all heard the story of a person who's just started a new job and gives it the I am chat. I've done this, I've done that at companies that I used to work for. I'm going to come in and we're going to change the way that we completely do everything. We're going to optimize, we're going to revolutionize, we're going to slash our budgets and produce more than ever before. Is that the type of motivational speech that would drive us on for someone that's just 5 minutes in the door? Probably not. Yeah, that's the type of person that you just wouldn't find as a great motivator or inspirational. But if we stay humble and remember that it's God doing the lifting, things are so much different. If we look at 1 Peter 5, verses 5 and 6, and all of you dress yourselves in humility as you relate to one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So humble yourselves under the mighty power of God, and at the right time, he will lift you up in honor. So that's my first point. Stay humble. When God's given you a dream, stay humble and let him guide your steps. And recognize that he is the source of your dreams and he is the one that's going to make the way for you. Don't go trying to be the I am. Trust in the I am. The God who is above all principalities and powers. He is the King of kings and the Lord of lords. He is the one who will lift you up to places that you could never get to by yourself, places that you could never dream of. He will bring those dreams to effect. And it's God who does the elevating, not you, not me, God. Now, learning to be humble and stay humble, it's a bit of an ongoing battle, isn't it? Yeah. We all like a little bit of someone massaging our ego a bit, saying, oh, you did great there. Yeah. But just remember that the gifts and talents that you have come from God, and give him the glory for it. Yeah. I'm not saying it's going to be an easy journey to do that. The longer that you've been a Christian, you get more used to it, but you've still got that struggle that's ongoing. So just remember, keep humble before God. Yeah, the enemy of our souls, or the devil, he will try to tell you that you need to promote yourself and make your own way. But you know what? We've got an alternative to that. That is just trusting in God, and remember that it's him that does the lifting and the elevating to those new platforms. Bring your every day before God in prayer and thank him for the good times and the bad. He has been there with you every single step of the way, and give him the glory that he deserves for helping you through each and every situation. He knows you and he loves you and only wants to see the best for you. He is the perfect parent, and we can have a wonderfully close relationship with him. We just need to remember that it's God that gets the glory, not us. So as we look back at Joseph and the resistance that he faced with his brothers, they plot to kill him. But then they decide against that and say, actually, let's just sell him into slavery. So in Genesis 37:28, so when the Ishmaelites, who were Midianite traders, came by, Joseph's brothers pulled him out of the cistern and sold him to them for 20 pieces of silver. And the traders took him to Egypt. So I think we can all agree that being sold into slavery is probably going to be a pretty low point, isn't it? Yeah. I don't know if any of you would want to experience that. Doesn't sound like the best, does it? But it was a low point in Joseph's life. He goes from being the number one son to being someone else's slave and having nothing, no material possessions whatsoever. Yeah. How easy would it be for us to get bitter in that situation? Yeah, you have your life of relative luxury removed from you very forcefully and quickly, and all of your possessions that you'd grown accustomed to removed. But how we react in situations that are sent to test us and test our mettle really shows how we're growing. Do you get bitter or do you get better? So that's my second point for today, is get better, not bitter. Make sure you get those the right way around, because it's a bit of a tongue twister, that. So if Joseph had been bitter and went on to act poorly as a slave, then we probably would have found that this low point would have become even more of a struggle, and it could have very easily have spiraled into something much, much worse. Instead, he was persistent and resisted the urge to get better, and instead got better. Now we can see that in Genesis 39, verses 1 and 2. When Joseph was taken to Egypt by the Ishmaelite traders, he was purchased by Potiphar, an Egyptian officer. Potiphar was captain of the guard for Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. The Lord was with Joseph, so he succeeded in everything he did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. Now we see Joseph relied on God in his low point, and that low point went on to become a turning point in his life. God doesn't leave us when our circumstances change or things get tough. He is the same God, and he still loves you the exact same, no matter what we're going through. If we rely on God and be the best that you can be in that situation, we'll see that change. And people will start to take notice. I'm sure we can all easily remember the hard times in our lives. They seem to be the stories that just keep coming back to the top of your mind. And if we keep reminiscing on that, we can start thinking that nothing's ever going to get better in those bad times. But with God, it's not like that. What do we choose to hold on to? Do we hold on to the bitterness and resentment that comes up when we keep feeling sorry for ourselves, or when we end up in a bad situation? Or do we turn to God? Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Do we turn to God in our darkest moments and ask him to bring his light to the situation? We can look on in fear as we struggle to see what's in the darkness. Or we can just turn on the light and see what God wants us to see and live in the light that he has for you. Invite him in to share your everyday. In your time alone with God, just speak to him. Ask him to help you get rid of the bitterness and get better and grow in his strength. When we choose to get better, great things can start happening. Now, if Joseph had stayed bitter, then I don't think he would have got very far as a slave. But he decided to get better and remembered that it was God that he's serving, not his Egyptian master, not Potiphar. It was God. And if we look on to Genesis 39, verse 3, Potiphar noticed this and realized that the Lord was with Joseph, giving him success in everything he did. This pleased Potiphar, so he soon made Joseph his personal attendant. He put him in charge of his entire household and everything he owned. So we can see that as Joseph relied on God, Potiphar saw that, and his strength to be the best that he could be in that situation, and it turns into growing in favor with God and with Potiphar. We'll go a bit further on into verse 6. So Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything he owned. With Joseph there, he didn't have to worry about a thing except what kind of food to eat. Doesn't that sound good? Yeah. So everything looked after, and you've only got to worry about food. And not even cooking it. Sounds like a right life of luxury there. Now, it goes on. Joseph was a very handsome and well-built young man. And Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully. "Come and sleep with me," she demanded. But Joseph refused. "Look," he told her, "my master trusts me with everything in his entire household. No one here has more authority than I do. He has held back nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God." So we can see here that with his success also comes challenges and temptations. There's more tests and trials that come with this success. So, and when we start to think, oh yeah, we're doing well, we're on a bit of a mountaintop moment in our lives, feel like everything's going great, there's nothing that can stop you. And then wham, along suddenly comes a temptation or a trial that tries to derail you. You need to keep resisting that temptation and not giving into it. Joseph persisted in resisting the temptation. But you know what? It still put him back to almost where he started. Potiphar's wife lied about him and what he did. And he ended up in prison because of that. He was at the lowest of lows. I think that probably would have ranked a bit lower even than being sold as a slave. He's locked up. He's got no freedom whatsoever. But God and Joseph didn't give up. Prison wasn't the end of the story for him. Joseph continued to be the same. no matter what his circumstances were. If we look in verse 21, but the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love. And the Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden. So God had again raised Joseph above the rest. He's going on this bit of a roller coaster ride. And he's now at the top of the prison. So elevated above anyone else that's in that same circle. Several years passed with Joseph in prison, but he had a gift of interpreting dreams. We saw it at the very start of the story with his brothers, but now he was in prison and interpreting dreams for some of Pharaoh's servants. And he interpreted a dream for Pharaoh's cupbearer who was in prison at the time. And then eventually the news of this gets back to Pharaoh. And before Joseph knew it, he was standing before the highest power in the land. But Joseph still recognized that there was a power even higher than that, than Pharaoh, and that power was God. Through his faith in believing in God and giving God the glory, Joseph is raised from the prison to the palace. He was asked to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. Now, I'm quite sure that Pharaoh probably wouldn't have been one to take bad news easily. Maybe a bit like Joseph's brothers in how they took the news. But Joseph had learned from the time in his valleys. He'd grown in his humility and grown in favor with God throughout his time in the valleys. This had brought wisdom to the way that Joseph approached things and approached challenges. He tells Pharaoh about the 7 years of plenty followed by the 7 years of famine that is going to be in Egypt. And throughout that, he kept growing. Now, my third point is resistance brings strength. So Joseph's faced a lot of resistance so far throughout his life. He faced the resistance in the prison. He faced it with his brothers. He faced it in being sold as a slave. But when he was in prison, it was like he was stopped from entering his destiny on all angles. He was kept from those that he loved and from the promise that he knew was over his life. This was a consistent resistance that he couldn't get away from, but the more that he pushed against the resistance and didn't let it break him, the stronger that he became. Now, think about if you're being in a gym. You face resistance there on almost everything that you do. If you're lifting weights, then the weights add resistance to prevent you from pulling too far, too fast. And that brings strength. The rowing machine stops you from being able to pull on it like it was just a light chain. It creates resistance. And as you push into that resistance, you get stronger and your muscles start to develop. But I think it's even the same with the wind. We can't see it, but we can certainly feel the resistance that you get when you walk in head on into a strong wind. It's pretty difficult, isn't it? Sometimes you get lucky and it's blowing behind you, though. So that's, it can become a bit easier there. But if we know how important resistance is to our physical development and bringing strength there, how much more important is it for our spiritual development? The more challenges that we come up against, the more tests that we face, the stronger that we become by not giving in to those temptations, not giving in to the trials. So, and we've already looked at some of the resistance that Joseph had faced. He had some of the worst situations imaginable that he had to deal with. And most of us aren't going to face anything like that. And if Joseph was able to rely on God through those situations, how much more should we be able to rely on him through our situations that are often nowhere near as difficult as that? Sometimes, yes, we do face much harder trials, but just rely on God through every single trial that you go through. You know, Joseph faced so many trials, you know, going from his father's favorite to being a slave, to going to be the top of Potiphar's household, to being in prison, and then going into the palace. He'd certainly had a life full of ups and downs, but throughout it all, he'd remained faithful to God. He recognized where his power came from. So point 4 for today, and that's my last point, is recognize the power source. Yeah. As we go into our successes, are we recognizing that the power source, or do we like to take all the credit? Yeah. It's not easy to always give God the glory. But it's kind of part of our human nature to want to get the praise. But the more that you recognize the power source, the more you'll see God working in your life. It's often easier to recognize God as being our source when times are tough and we're in a low place, usually because we want a bit of help from God. You know, we ask him to help us out of the place, but then we can fail to recognize him when times are good and when things are going well. But it's really in those good times that shows how close your relationship with God is. Yeah, are you still giving him the praise in the good times? Or is it just when you need help with something that you remember to thank him for those good times? The lessons that Joseph had learned in his times of resistance had given him so much favor with God and the ruler of the kingdom that he has been raised to great heights that only God could do. When you learn to grow in strength with God, then great things happen. Don't let distractions drag you down. Focus on what God has got planned for your life. Keeping laser focused on God, and through him, you will grow in strength and stature. I'm going to look at Psalms 18, verse 32. God arms me with strength, and he makes my way perfect. And Philippians 4:13. For I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength. Now, remember that colleague that I told you about? Still living off that yacht story. But Joseph's story shows us that with God, your best days are never behind you. They're still ahead of you. If you stay humble, get better, not better, grow through resistance and recognize the power source. Now, that same God that helped Joseph to come through his struggles still lives, and he can live in you. Joseph's day, the only way to get to heaven was by being righteous and making sacrifices of animals. But Jesus came along to change that. Now we no longer have to sacrifice animals for forgiveness of our sins. Jesus took that entire requirement and he paid in full for all of our sins on the cross. Now, the good news today is that he is waiting for you. He is ready to accept you as one of his own. God no longer sees the mess that you've made and the things that you have done that draw you away from him. All he sees when he looks at you is love. He loves you in an unconditional way that will never, ever change. If you want to accept him into your life, then we'll have a time for you to do that. Joseph, he went from the pit to the palace, but Jesus went from heaven to the cross so that you could go from death to life. That same God who was with Joseph in the prison, he wants to be with you in your struggles today. And because of Jesus, you don't have to be stuck in the past. He gives you a brand new future. Now we're all just going to take a moment and pray and ask for salvation. Yeah, just going to ask everyone to repeat it after me. Dear God, thank you for sending your Son, Jesus, to die in my place. Thank you that you made a way to enter heaven and live in your eternal salvation. I ask you to come into my heart and change me from the inside out, that you would help me to live in your plan for my life and guide me for the rest of my days. Amen. Now we're just going to have a bit of a time of Thanksgiving with the band. So over to you, Matthew.
Let's stand together if we can, and let's